Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm just so grateful. I'm just so excited to be part of this amazing conversation around decolonization and looking at it not just from a research, but also for us who are working in practice and doing research and also looking at our experiences. The last presentation was fantastic. So I'm joining from Zimbabwe, from my village, and I can resonate with sitting behind the baobab tree to share knowledge, because that's exactly where I am. I want to put the context of my work around decolonizing knowledge in practice and why that became very important to me, to my organization, and to the work we do globally on children and women's rights, focusing on girls. A little bit of the background is, yes, I'm a human rights lawyer and I'm a feminist and an African feminist. And I serve as the African Union Goodwill Ambassador on ending child marriage. And for the last 25, 30 years, my strong work on women's human rights and working with girls, especially, both from the work in the United Nations, the work in a faith-based organization, and now living in my village. I always say I work from the womb of patriarchy. And that womb of patriarchy, for us to secure rights, is also defined in my context in Zimbabwe of 100 years of colonialism. And the 100 years of colonialism shaped what is law. I remember when I was at law school that we were very conversant with the decisions of Lord Denning and the decisions that are made in the English courts and in Roman Dutch law more than in customary law. We knew less of the decisions and the key positions in the customary justice system, and was so much very proud of knowing human rights, Roman Dutch and English jurisprudence. And years later, when I'm supporting and contributing to women's rights in my community and to children's rights in Africa, I realized that there's a clash between the dual system of knowledge. The dual system that is informed in terms of our laws by the colonial laws, whether it's the French countries, the French colonized countries, or it's the Portuguese colonized countries in Africa, or us who are Anglophone. Always the challenges of the work that we see every day is really addressing the duality of the law. And this duality of the law is also then linked to the duality of norms and values. And it's also linked to how have our post-independent institutions, our government, to what extent have they provided adequate support to building on local knowledge, local systems, and local values in a way that aligns with the international agreed human rights standards. Because for me, the standards that we use and should ascribe to are then the agreed international standards, which require both a decolonization of the law, or to some extent, and thought and knowledge, but also requires our customary norms and values and approaches to also be transformed for them to align with the same international human rights standard. And in doing that, we are very much steeped in the consciousness and the reality of patriarchy. So this is where I'm coming from. My work with girls on ending child marriage, which actually in itself is a language that carries with it an assumption that marrying off little girls is accepted at a certain level, whether by custom or by law, which essentially is the essence of decolonization. We are saying whether by custom or by law, we need to align the values in a way that we do not tolerate rape of our children and justify it whether within our legal system or within our customary systems. So that is where I started from. Secondly, as I worked with girls over the years in my community globally, I realized that every time we would be advancing issues of girls and women, we hit a wall. And the wall that we were dealing with were multiple walls, one behind the other. The first wall that we would get is, well, Nyaradzayi, what you are advocating is not documented. I'm like, but it's my whole life. I'm asking for safe spaces for girls because we've always had spaces for girls, whether they are safe or not. We've always had these Nanga spaces for girls, but it's not documented. Therefore, what is not documented, researched on, and where it's reviewed in the journals, it's not knowledge. And my life is knowledge. So what I'm bringing to you is also the challenge that we have, that African knowledge in many of our societies to do with our lives is orally transmitted from generation to generation. But what is considered as knowledge is if you have published. And that for me is the first challenge around colonization, that what we know as a people is not considered as knowledge unless if it is documented. But documentation is not the only form of transmission of knowledge and values. And this is why I'll come to our Nanga and why it was critical for us to document. We had to document. And I'll share with you the documentation later. Yes, I actually have my pamphlet where we have documented our Nanga. We have a big publication of our multi-country study on these safe spaces for girls. The third problematic for me was when working at the policy level with governments, both African governments and other governments in the United Nations system, the whole area of sexuality education and comprehensive sexuality education for girls. We would come across notions that, well, these issues are not discussed, they are taboo. Notions that these are myths. We would come across the issues we are struggling with of female genital cutting, female genital mutilation, the tough issues of child marriage, the complexities, and would find our government spending a lot of time negotiating language. And I know even WHO recently from in the General Assembly dealing with this strategy and out decisions, we're struggling with an agreed language. I looked into what is in the text and what is the lived experience. Then I realized, actually, we talk a lot of sex in my culture, but we don't talk about it in the formal workshops that are designed in the traditional way that we do our development work. No, but it's talked thoroughly, and at times crudely, and at times wrongly, and at times in a way that is not acceptable, you know. So I started to investigate what are those spaces within which some of these conversations happen, and what is the nature of the discussions that happen there. And that led me to the Nanga research. I think the last problematic was when I was appointed the AU Goodwill Ambassador for the African Union. I was the General Secretary globally of the World Young Women's Christian Association. And we started to look into the single gender space and say, what are the single gender spaces that exist? We realized they are there as NGOs, we have women's organizations, we have the YWCAs, we have the YMCAs, which are single gender for men, for women, we have the Girl Scouts, we have the Girl Guides. Why did we have single gender spaces, and why the push to include or not to include? Then working with girls, we started to see models that were very exciting models developed by NGOs. Population Council developed their safe spaces models. There are so many safe spaces models. But I wanted to then go back to the earlier problematic and say, but what existed culturally? What existed and which continues to transmit certain values? And so I undertook this research. I founded Rosaria Memorial Trust 15 years ago, which works with girls in honor of my late mother. And my mother did not choose my father. She was married off to my father. So her own story and my own story and the stories of our communities led me to do a regional research and understand what are the spaces that has existed culturally and traditionally to provide information to girls, and are they still surviving? Are they still there? What holds them together? What is the knowledge that goes on in there? I had no idea that I'm actually going into a totally exciting new world of knowledge, of undocumented knowledge and undocumented experiences. And I feel we are just at the beginning of doing that. I also am very respectful that maybe not everything has to be fully documented. We have to respect the cultures. So we undertook a regional study on those safe spaces. I'll share with you the publication and the link. I undertook the study in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, Malawi, Mozambique, and Eswatini, Swaziland. And in each of the countries, they use different language to what we call Enanga in the Shona culture, which is called a Chinamali among the certain groups, ethnic groups in Zambia and Malawi, Nyumba ya Wasikana in Kiswahili, Egumeni in Eswatini, Emali in Mozambique, and various communities use different language. These have continued to exist despite the advent of modern religion, whether that is Christianity or Islam or other forms of religion, because these are structures that also receive the onslaught, if I can use that word, from religion, because everything to do with culture, most, not everything, I don't want to exaggerate, most of the things to do with culture, most, with the coming of colonialism and modern religion, they were either demonized or they were seen as being uncivilized. So they were defined as uncivilized, unprogressive, or demonized. So that in itself meant indigenous African knowledge around feminism and around women's rights, and our own spaces were not given formal recognition. They were not nurtured. They were not supported. They were not given the same value. Knowledge about our own bodies, which we used to get in Enanga, was no longer invested just in Enanga, but was more invested in a formal school. But in a formal school, the four walls of a school, you are in a mixed group of boys and girls. And certain knowledge which was transmitted to girls in a direct way of saying, this is your breast, this is your vagina, keep it clean, don't let anybody touch it. In school, you are just told from a biology point of view, but not from a full understanding of the little girl, understanding her body in a way that she can ask questions. Equally for boys, they had their own spaces, but I didn't research about the boys. I researched about the girls. I realized that from the research that I did, I'll talk about funding, but this was more a scoping study. It was more a general operational study, but not deep in depth. I would like to really research more on this. I realized that the Nanga or Chinamali or Egumeni was actually a formal education system with age cohorts. The little girls, certain discussions would happen with the little girls, the 5-year-olds, the 8-year-olds, the 12-year-olds. Once a girl is about to have a period, or he has had a period, would still be part of the Nanga, but the curriculum changed. The content in the discussion would shift because now they are being prepared for motherhood, they've prepared for sex, sexuality, dating issues. Was the little girls, it was more around hygiene, around respect, around those, some of the content would continue. But when it's older girls who are above 21 and not married, they'll still be part of the Nanga. Or older girls who have been married and came back, either divorce or separation, they'll still come back into the Nanga. But for those girls, also the content of the discussion would shift. The Nanga, in terms of character, is just the space we meet, sleep as girls in a village, in our houses, but it's a girl-led space, but also an intergenerational space. For me, this was very important concept that mostly the girls are the majority, they define their space, but also elders, the aunties, the mamas, the grandmothers, they would also come into that space. They are the mentors. So also what is very exciting for me is that the Nangas were not just about discussion around health, sexuality, growing up, motherhood, dating. It was also a space for transmitting knowledge and practical skills. We would not just sit in a Nanga. Even when I was growing up, you'd either be shelling groundnuts, you'd either be making bangles, you'd either be knitting. So the multitasking, and we have time to actually be taught how to do the bangles with reeds, with indigenous products in our community. And that is how people were taught to protect the environment, because you knew each plant and its value. So when we are now talking about environment and protection, indigenous knowledge was transmitted to the girls in that Nanga. So as would be multitasking to do peanut butter, to know how to do peanut butter. Of course, by that time, there were not the machines. Now, of course, we need the technology. And for me, it was very interesting just to, in the research, to know that practical skills around critical skills for survival, but critical skills for thriving. So you just learn things for you to be a good mother feeding her children, but also how to be a market woman, how to have your pumpkin leaves, how to dry your vegetables and go and sell. So it was also about entrepreneurship. So most of this knowledge is now expected to be transmitted in schools. The school curriculums are critical, but at times they are also not carrying the full knowledge. So for me, I feel we still need to have both the formal and non-formal education, because not all girls continue in the formal education. Kids are dropping out. We see it with COVID, we see it with child marriage, we see it with teenage pregnancy, we see it with poverty. Girls need another space to learn about themselves, to learn skills to survive. And for me, that Nanga, reconstructing a Nanga, is part of embedding knowledge and skills to girls in the non-formal space, which our cultures and traditions respect, own, and control, and can facilitate, and it's low cost, because the formal schools looked down and did not value our traditional educational systems. Fully understand, it was also part of the managing power, but also the Nangas are part of strategizing. Girls and women need space to generate power, to share power. So at times I feel when we say that women are not in decision making, I feel that we've also lost the spaces where women strategized, even during the liberation struggles. The women's spaces were the spaces where women would also strategize, would share intel, whose girl is where, whose child is where, who needs to do what, where are the military bases, where are the soldiers. And I am a product of war. I was an adolescent girl during the liberation of my country. So I fully understand that part of our protection was also having those spaces where, as little girls, people would whisper. The radio was not reaching. People would say, please empty the village. Tomorrow the army is coming to bomb our village. We had spaces for information and knowledge because the radios were not there or they were not safe. So these community social systems of social protection, of building knowledge, of sharing are so important, and they've been eroded. They've been eroded, and yet they remain very essential. Not everything. I talked about us researching the Nanga from both a feminist perspective, a women's rights perspective, and also being part of fighting patriarchy. In the Nangas, we also, and continue even today, some of the practices that we need to end. We must end female genital mutilation. In Southern Africa, we don't do the cutting, it's more the pulling. Behind the female genital pulling, it's all about, whether cutting or pulling, it's all about men controlling female sexuality. It's about pleasure and male sexual pleasure. And it's also about controlling the assumptions around women having other relationships. So we need to address those, but some of the conversation cannot just happen in a mixed group, in a village workshop where the father-in-law and the uncle and the husband are sitting together in the same meeting with the daughter-in-law. This is why I feel that some of our traditional, our current methods of delivering knowledge do not fully understand that there are certain things I cannot openly say in a village meeting with my husband's young brother sitting there and we talk about sexual pleasure. You can't. You know, so for me, decolonizing is not just about the knowledge, it's also about processes of transmitting the knowledge. it's also around what is valued. So last week or 2 weeks ago, we were celebrating, we were not celebrating, we were observing the Menstrual Health Day. I refused to call it the Menstrual Hygiene Day, because what we were taught in Enanga is that menstruation is not just about hygiene. It's about our health, our rights, and our responsibilities. Menstruation is the essence of womanhood, is that which defines who we are as being female and the rights that ascribes to the female. So it's not just a hygiene conversation. And this is what was ingrained, and this is what is ingrained in Enanga. So girls who go through Enanga would commemorate the Menstrual Health and Hygiene Day with both the hygiene messages, but also with other messages relating to being at risk of abuse, knowing your responsibilities around pregnancies, knowing what it means to have a period, and of course, knowing how to manage your period so that you don't show around the pad and you have somewhere to dispose. And of course, the challenges of getting a proper something to use, because not all girls in our villages can get a pad. So with where we are, I run community nangas in over 20 community nangas. Every time we have over 2,000 girls with us. We are actually hosting a major virtual nanga on the 17th as part of the Day of the African Child. And we also play football. So what the conclusion I've reached in our methodology was to reconstruct Enanga as a feminist space which advances human rights, which embraces technology. We don't have to remain where we were 100 years ago. No, we have to actually transform the cultural spaces for us to advance certain values which are scientific, with knowledge which is scientific. But we should not lose the essence of the informal space. We should not lose this essence of single gender spaces. We should not lose the essence of transmitting life-saving skills. We should not lose the essence of using the Nanga to promote formal education, and also some of the values in those Nanga sitting on our mats to level power. And this time it doesn't have to be a mat. We can sit on a nice cushioned pillow or a nice little mattress. But what is important is the principle that we level power. People sit at the same level. There's nobody at the high table, because it's very important. Just like we sit under the baobab tree, we are all leveling power. We are leveling who we are. We continue to share around importance of our artifacts, the artifacts which expresses who we are and our knowledge. This is why I really encourage everybody to wear the African dress. we love that, because it's more than just a dress. It's also about telling the story. I really feel it's research which is just starting. When I started the documentation, it was very hard to get funding, because I was questioning the norm. I was questioning the usual rhetoric where every sentence starts with African culture is bad. And here I am saying, yes, there are bad things that we need to transform and shift in the African culture, but there are also great stuff that we need to go to scale, that we need to replicate, because we'll always be who we are. And that knowledge which has been transmitted for generations and generations and over hundreds of years, who are we to just throw it away. The basic knowledge that a musekesa tree is beautiful because you can make donuts on those leaves. You can use the bark for doing a belt. You can use the shade when it's cold, and it needs to protect the wetlands because we need to protect our water underground. Why should we close our nanga, which was telling us that we can survive intergenerationally and people and planet must coexist? Why should we close that nanga where we can actually invite the village elder to sit with the girls, and the girls tell that she has been abused and we want that man to be sanctioned, to be dealt with? So for me, it's around the African Renaissance is not complete. We will not have a complete African Renaissance without a feminist approach where women own their own knowledge, their own spaces, their own cultures. But we equally need to have a good opportunity for us to have that knowledge be defined in a way where it's core-led and core-owned. We are looking at patenting, copywriting our Nanga as a public resource and not as owned by Rosaria Memorial Trust. We would like it to be a publicly owned resource because we feel it's important for us to protect it as a public commons. I'm still looking at how to go around that and where to get the money for doing that. But we are very conscious. I am very, very conscious that this is work that is just starting, and it requires a lot of support in the area of research, but at the same time to be done in a way that the girls in my little village, the women, the mothers, the aunties lead in that research, and we are the facilitators of knowledge, but not the owners. We don't own because it's owned by its people, and therefore decolonizing research and practice also demands that we have methodologies that can continue to build ownership where it lies and relies. As we also know that we cannot go back to the pre-colonial era. We need an infusion of knowledge and practice because the notion of globalization, it's real. And therefore, I'm also very clear in my own experience. I mean, I lived in Switzerland for almost 10 years. And I know that including in Europe and other cultures, people protect and value their own cultures. I mean, everybody does. And we are always looking at those, and saying, what are the implications? I've been following the Jubilee that was going on. And I'm like, you know what I'm seeing here is also an affirmation of the cultures of that lies behind the monarchy. It's not just about affirming the modern English culture, but it's also sustaining their own culture. And so equally, I have mine, and I'm documenting it, and I need you all to support us in doing that work. Thank you so much, and back to you.
So much for this fascinating talk. Thank you. I will just open the floor. Yeah, we have some questions. I don't know who started first.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening to you. You touched on so many questions or so many aspects that raised so many questions. So I would like to connect after the discussion again today. I guess for me, the most salient question I have at the moment is the idea of knowledge sharing and you know, making sure that we don't. Sorry.
Sorry, there's feedback at the background. I'm missing the question. Nancy, could you assist?
Sorry.
No, there is a noise. Can you unmute your mic for a second, please?
I'm muted.
Nyaradzayi, can you mute your mic for a second?
Okay.
Okay. So I was wondering, just with regards to the concept of research is colonial by nature. So if I am trying to pursue a career in applied social work where I want to combine research with practical development of interventions for people in South Africa. How do you have any suggestions on how we can talk about and open those discussions about you know, trying to understand and learn from each other when the concept of doing research or ethical approval or many of the things that we have to do for research is unfamiliar? And yeah, I think let's leave it at that.
Thank you so much. Actually, I have, we just got our ethical approval last week for a research that I'm doing with the University College of London with Dr. Rochelle Beggars, focusing on mental health and child marriage and looking at how the Nanga was a place for counseling for girls. So I think there are three key advice that I can give based on my research work and also doing activities in the community. The first is, as you do the design of your program or your project of your intervention, invest sufficiently around the baseline evidence that you need, that would inform your theory of change and that would inform the interventions that you want to do, because then that gives you the opportunity to do the research components, both in an academic perspective, so that your work is grounded in the theories, in the trends, in the emerging thinking, in the contradictions. And as you do that, be very intentional on what are the dimensions of the work and the dimensions of the research that can contribute to decolonization. So you can look at it either from the research question, from the proposed intervention, or from the methodology of the research. The second important area is you develop the tools, because then you need the research tools for the ethical clearances. It's very important to ensure that the methodology that you adopt would go beyond, as has been said in the first presentation, would go beyond the traditional data collection methodologies, because you are already with an understanding that if you use literature review as the only basis of getting published materials, you will not get all the information. You may need to go to the gray literature. You may need to get a little bit of some of the village reports and community reports, which might not be published. It gets you closer to the information that you need, and also to look at how you use some of the research methodologies, the storytelling. Just come and let's organize a Nanga with you and have those conversations which do not have a strict agenda, but which are free flowing. Allow people to sing. You know, song, even just, oh Lord, my God. When a person sings as part of your research methodology, you are getting the emotions, you are getting the stories behind which song they've chosen, what the words are, and you are delving into their dynamics, because every time when people sing, it's always contextual and it's always content driven. We do a lot of singing. We do a lot of ululating, you know, when we are happy, when we are sad, so I think just integrating some of the cultural communication methodologies into your research approach would also be part of both decolonizing research, validating that some of these research methods are valid. Of course, you have to do your triangulation naturally. What you've gotten from the songs, from the storytelling, is that echoing or giving further insights from your focus group discussions and your literature review, and what other surveys that you may do. I think the bit around implementation, during implementation of your intervention or your program, document as much as you can. And now with literature, with technology, get the consent that you need from the communities and the participants in your program, so that you have as much of the primary information as possible. And I insist on getting consent, because at times we then see the videos or the stories, and the names of the people are just a woman from Murewa. She has a name. Let's give her her name. Or a traditional leader from Rirongwe. He has a name. Part of decolonizing is giving people their identity. And I know that the EU has a data protection protocol, which is very strict. I think in research, we really need to go an extra effort around images so that we name. If you can't name, it means that person cannot speak for themselves.